All right, well, it is 6:30, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to this evening's program, Culinaria Germania. My name is Beth. I'm the adult programming librarian for the Mid-Continent Public Libraries. So I plan all of our virtual and in-person adult programs. We're glad everybody could join us this evening. For those of you who just joined us, we are going to ask that folks stay muted. We are recording this evening's program, and that'll help us get a good recording. I will share out the link to the recording once it is available on our YouTube channel. It usually takes a couple days after the program for us to be able to get that up. I've also dropped the link to tonight's survey in the chat, and I will email it out to everyone at the end of the program. But if you can take a moment to fill that out and let us know how we did, that helps us to continue to get funding for programs like these. I'm also going to ask that if you have questions during the program, you type them in chat. We will save time at the end of the program to go through those. Finally, I wanted to mention some upcoming programs here. So I'm going to share my screen. And the first program that I want to mention is Exploring Western Ireland. World traveler Gene Flynn is going to be back with us to share his visit to Western Ireland, and we'll have an opportunity to view the rural life that once dominated almost all of Ireland, as well as learn a little history of the region. That one is October 14th at 6:30 here on Zoom. On October 22nd at 6:30, also here on Zoom, we have Sweet and Savory Halloween. Culinarian Vanessa Young will be back to celebrate Halloween with us with some fun ideas for savory and sweet dishes that you can make that incorporate the holiday colors as well as the flavors of the fall. So looking forward to some new recipes there. On October 30th, Frank Mendoza will be back with Jamie Lee Curtis, the Halloween season Scream Queen. He'll be talking about the life and work of Jamie Lee Curtis, who is still going strong with smash hits like Knives Out, some Halloween sequels in the works, as well as another Freaky Friday movie. And she's also a best-selling children's author. So, and then on November 4th, Jean will be back again, this time with a visit to Normandy, the D-Day beaches, and Brittany. So we'll take a virtual trip to Rouen, Bayeux, all the D-Day beaches, and Mont Saint-Michel, as well as a final stop in Brittany. And then finally, on November 12th at 6:30, Vanessa will be back with wholesome and cozy fall dinners. So we'll learn how to make a roast chicken dinner with some vegetable dishes and more. So we hope you can join us for some of those programs. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here so that I can turn it over to Annette and let her share her screen so she can get started with this evening's program, where we'll enjoy a look at some German cuisine.
Exactly. Let me just make sure that everything. Okay. Now. Okay. Okay, then good afternoon, everybody. I'm so glad that you have logged on because we are going to talk about German food. I hope that you have already eaten because if you have not, you're going to be very, very um, hungry in about an hour. I am Annette Isaacs. I am a German lady and a public educator, and I am uh, somebody who's talking about Germany for a living, one could say. I have about 40 different topics, or even now, maybe 45 different topics that I talk about. And of course, every time in October, there are two of my programs that are quite popular. And one is, and this morning I just did that because I'm coming to you from Miami. So I was at a retirement community in Fort Lauderdale, and there I did a presentation about the history of German beer. And now, of course, tonight I get to talk about German food. And when we are thinking or talking about German food, what comes to mind? It, of course, would be what you see here on that picture: sauerkraut, bratwurst, then all kinds of beer, all kinds of breads. That is, what people think when they think about German food. Or if you take a look at this funny German food pyramid that I found on the internet, this is how the world sees us Germans and our food intake. This idea that the most important thing is bratwurst and then pretzels. And yes, our love for sauerkraut has, of course, earned us a nickname. And that is, of course, the nickname of Krauts. But look, this is actually a caricature from 1803. So 200 years ago, or more than 200 years ago, the English were already making fun of the Germans who were stuffing their faces with the nutritious cabbage. And yes, we do eat lots of sauerkraut, and we also adore our like thousands of different sorts of bread that we have available in Germany. We also, of course, appreciate our sausages and everything, and the beers, and not forget the wines. But I think, when it comes to German food history, there is so much more that we can actually talk about. And this is why we're here tonight. This presentation has two parts. The first part is a journey, one could say, through German food history. But then the second part, I am really going to take you on a trip. We're going to go back to Germany, and we're going to take a look at all the different German states and their iconic dishes, because we do have quite a varied regional difference when it comes to food. Like, people in Munich are not necessarily eating the same thing as people in Hamburg. And so this is really quite fascinating. And so everything starts in a way with this man. This is Charlemagne, or as we would say, Karl der Große. Charlemagne, after his death in the early 9th century, the German Empire that he had kind of held together was falling apart. And then in the subsequent decades and centuries, a significant territorialization of Germany followed. And that meant that there were literally hundreds, 300, more than 300 sovereign kingdoms, principalities, free cities, duchies, and they all had their own, and they were all like sovereign entities, right? And they all had their different food cultures and food preferences. And this makes for the variety of regional cuisines that we are going to talk about a little bit later. Then we have the Crusaders. The Crusaders are going, of course, to the Middle East and to the Islamic world between the 11th and the 13th centuries. And this great advantage of that was that when the Crusaders were coming back, they were actually able to bring back unknown sweets and also spices. And these spices, and when you think of it, this was so early on in history, most of those spices we are still using very much in our Christmas baking. For example, ginger, nutmeg, cinnamon, cloves, all of that. Then, between the 11th and the 14th centuries, the population in those German territories grew steadily, and most cities were founded during that time. But the growing cities experienced a devastating blow in those 2 years, 1348 and 1349, because this is when the plague arrived. And what you see here, that's so fascinating. That actually is a doctor, and that doctor has a doctor's beak. And that is, if you want to call it, a primitive gas mask that was worn by physicians at the time. They had this mask, and then they had the beak, and then they took the beak and they stuffed spices, those spices that at the time they already knew that they had. The spices and herbs were then stuffed into that beak, and then they were breathing through it, and then they were hoping that, of course, that would ward off the plague. Unfortunately, wasn't very scientific, I have to say. But interestingly enough, the death of so many people, and there were just so many people who died during those 2 years, the death of them had a curious side effect, and that was that meat consumption rose sharply because you have so many people who were dead, and these would have been like peasants, right? These would have been farmers. And so that is why we have so many fields that are laying fallow. And so that is why these surviving farmers were using them for grazing and not for farming. So that is why the like cows and the pigs and the sheep and everything, they were thriving. And so that is why people were able to have kind of lots of protein, right? So then we have the Renaissance, and that also saw a successful trade system that had been formed with the South and with the Orient through Arab and Venetian merchants. And because of that, sugar came to Europe and to Germany, and it sooner but later, it was replacing honey as the main sweetener. But at that time, sugar was still very expensive, and really only the nobility was able to afford it. It took until the early 20th century that sugar became a daily ingredient in Germany, also for the lower classes. This hegemony, that trade hegemony, of those, Arab and Venetian merchants was successfully interrupted by the Germans again for the Hanseatic League. And as you can see here, we have the North Sea and the Baltic Sea and all these kind of colorful areas. These are entities. These are like like cities and states and so on, and they are all subsumed under the Hanseatic League. And that was founded in 1356. And so I would say, this is like an old-timey European Union, one could say. And it was really incredible because there were 80 entities that were doing trade with each other. And at that time, again, we are very early on, we're in the 14th century, people in Germany were able to have, for example, fruit from the Mediterranean, herring from Norway, oil from the Provence, wines from Spain, from Italy, skins, fats from Russia, copper, iron from Sweden, textiles from Flanders, which of course is now Belgium. Now people were able to obtain ingredients that they never could have obtained before. Things like figs, currants, rice, capers, almonds. And that was really quite exciting. Then in the 16th century, we have lemons, cauliflower, and Savoy cabbage that they are finding, their way over the Alps from Italy. And from that also comes the idea of eating salads, because that was something that the Italians had done before the Germans. And so the Germans are learning how to eat salads, and not only that, but also how to prepare salads, because they had olive oils and nut oils, but of course they were very expensive. And so only the nobility was able to have like a nice walnut oil. But the normal people, they were having vinegar that they used in order, and also meat wheat broth in order to flavor the lettuce. The sheer bounty of available fruits and vegetables can be seen here in this beautiful painting by the Dutch artist Peter Aertsen, who internalized that market woman here who is showing off her delicious produce in 1567. The stereotypical sauerkraut, isn't that a fun picture? The sauerkraut is not German, by the way. I have to tell you this. This actually originated 2,300 years in ancient China as a way to preserve cabbage. It was brought to Germany in the 1200s by the invading armies of Genghis Khan. And the great advantage, of course, of sauerkraut is that it's very healthy. It's full of vitamin C, it's very nutritious. So, for example, especially in northern Germany, you have a lot of, like sailors who were taking it with them when they were sailing around the world and so on, because it was good for scurvy, it was kind of, kind of preventing it and so on. So really sauerkraut has become a healthy, and a trusted culinary companion for many, many Germans. When we go back to the 16th century, we also have buckwheat, funnily enough. Buckwheat is coming from Russia, and this evolves into one of the most important crops in northern Germany until it was eventually replaced by the potato in the 18th century. We also, of course, as we know, have liquid bread. This is how we call beer, and beer was mostly created by the monks. We do have then later on, we see, when I'm talking about monks, they were already added with the beer production like 1,000 years ago. We do have then the court breweries, which would be, if you take the word court brewery, then you would translate it into German and it would be Hofbräuhaus. So these were breweries that belonged to secular rulers. So beer had always been a very important beverage. But when it comes to the monks, they were realizing that if beer made with really great ingredients, that would actually be something very nourishing. And one of the reasons why monks were so interested in beer was because of the fasting. If anybody here on that call is Lutheran, you of course are going to get a kick out of this, because Martin Luther, when he was a monk very early on in his life, he hated being a monk because of all of those fasting days, because every third day basically was a fasting day. And so that is why this whole beer tradition that we have in Germany was in a way introduced by the monks. Not only that, in these big monasteries, they not only had breweries, but they also had wonderful bakeries. And they sometimes even had these big ovens where people from the towns, they were able to kind of make their own dough, and then they would go to the monastery, and then they would be able to use the ovens in order to bake their bread. And of course, can you imagine 3,200 different kinds of bread? It really, I have lived here in America for almost 20 years and I'm still missing, and I remember that when I came here, people would be asking me, so what do you miss the most? And of course, they would hope that I would say my parents, and I would always say bread. And I still miss it. Yikes. And when it comes to bread, very interesting. We also have these regional differences, because in northern Germany, people would have bread not, well, actually, they would have bread as a meal itself, and they would call it Morgenbrot, or the morning bread. And this was a big piece of bread, and that was buttered, and that would have either a herring on it or simple cheese. But then in central Germany, people were having unbuttered bread, and not really as a meal itself, but mostly as an accompaniment of a meal. And then they would, or maybe would have it as a little snack with a little beer and so on. But in the South, people were mostly eating soup and grits, or like grits, gruel, that kind of thing. That's how you would call it. How would you call that nowadays when you have? Now I'm having a senior moment. It's like these little, as we would say, oatmeal. This kind of thing. And so that's why to this day, let's say you would travel to Germany, right? And you would go to Hamburg and you would go to a restaurant. And then, of course, you could come into the restaurant and the first thing you get is a beautiful bread basket, with kind of all kinds of different bread. So then you might travel from Hamburg to Munich and then you go to a restaurant there. What do you get? You get a basket, but that's going to be full of pretzels. You're not going to have hugely different sorts and usually different varieties of bread. And so it's really kind of fascinating that things that have been going on for like 500, 600, 700 years are still having traces, in today's Germany. There he is, Martin Luther, of course, the driving force of the Reformation. He got something started, I'm telling you. Of course, after the Reformation, we also have some food-related changes that are happening in Germany, because in a nutshell, one could say that the North, after the Reformation, becomes Protestant. And the other thing is that now, when it comes to Germany post-Reformation, everybody who was living in an area had to have the same religion as their ruler. So if your king was Catholic, you had to be Catholic. If your king was Protestant, you had to be Protestant. And so that meant that there is in the 16th century, 17th century, during this time, you have a big migration, one could say, of people who just can't deal with this, and they are going to the South. They're going, especially Catholics, are going to the South. And so that means, though, that the South is now kind of overpopulated. And that means that the butchers are looking at all of this mayhem because there's so many people, and they're thinking, what are we going to do? How are we going to get those mouths fed? And that's when, you wouldn't believe it, they are interested in the cultivation of sausage making. So not only because of the Reformation, but it's one of the reasons why the south of Germany becomes really an expert when it comes to sausage making, because the butchers have to look at the entire pig or the entire other, cow or whatever, and they are saying, okay, what can we possibly use, because we have so many people who are now relatively poor, and who need to have food. When it comes to the North, people in the North are still having enough, space and time and whatever, and money and so on. They can have steaks or so on. But when it comes to the history of like the sausages, they are mostly, they were mostly created in the South. The other thing that also becomes extremely important in the South is Mehlspeisen. I love a Mehlspeise. Of course, when you look at what that is, it is a flour-based dish. And this is not something that you eat as an accompaniment. This is your meal. You have, for example, Spätzle. You make Spätzle, and you kind of mix some cheese into the Spätzle, and then you have Käsespätzle or cheese Spätzle, and people adore it, especially in the Stuttgart area. You have all kinds of pasta, you have dumplings, you have pancakes. You have pancakes maybe with apples, pancakes with kind of all kinds of plums and so on. So this is something that, of course, comes from Austria, and it also comes from Italy, because these are, of course, the countries that really are also dealing a lot with the flour-based dishes. Somebody in Hamburg is not going to eat a flour-based dish, right? It's really mostly the people in the South. The 30 Years' War, of course, from 1618 to 1648, had a devastating effect on basically all of Europe. The most important devastating effect was that many people died. Before the war, all of Europe had 17 million people living. When you think of it, how quaint, because now we have over 500 million people living in Europe. But at that time, it was 17. And then after the war was over, only 10 million people survived. And then, you are all coming into the picture, because what happens is, of course, that we have the world trade that is shifting from the Mediterranean, from the Hanseatic League to the Atlantic. And then all of a sudden, it's the British and the Dutch, and they are going to America, right? And so that is a problem. And so Germany, the Hanseatic League, is having a crises, right? And so Germany is kind of losing access to the Atlantic world trade. The Hanseatic League is losing influence and significance, and that's an issue. Not only that, we also have, after the 30 Years' War, we also have another fragmentation, another territorial fragmentation. So we have even more of those independent and sovereign entities. What does that mean? That means that we have an abundance of customs. Now everybody, of course, is saying, this is my territory, and if you come through my territory, you have to pay customs. So now the customs are becoming so unbearable, and tariffs, very up-to-date word. So here you see something interesting. This is the Rhine River. And so let's say somebody has, he's a merchant and he has his products, and he starts in, let's say, Koblenz, and he goes down to Basel. This would be about 150 miles. And it was not unusual that at that time in the 17th century, people would have to stop every 6 miles in order to pay customs at a custom house. So you can imagine how expensive things were getting. No, who never had any problems financially? The nobility, the rich people never had any problem. And of course, they were all, imitating France and the French Sun King. So he was an idol, not only for fashion, but also for food. When it comes to the nobility, it was all about French food. Fricassee, côtelette, like ragout, all kinds of French meals were also very famous in Germany. In 1680, we have the first silver sets that were consisting of matching spoons, knives, and forks. Unfortunately, I didn't find a spoon. And that was important. This was also introduced among the nobility, rather. And then, of course, we have porcelain coming from China. And that the first European porcelain factory was opened in Meissen, which is next to Dresden. And that happened in 1710. And of course, these porcelain vessels were coming in very handy for the 3 very important relatively new beverages, and they were coffee, tea, and hot chocolate. Very exciting. And then we have, of course, a watershed moment, and that is happening in the 16th century, though, but it then later on becomes important for us Germans in the 18th century. So what happened was that Spanish discoverers in 1596, actually, were in South America, and they were introduced by the people in South America to the papa. And of course, the papa is the potato. And then the potato came to Europe. First, it came to Spain, then Italy, then, of course, England, then also, of course, Ireland. We know especially the Irish have this very love-hatred relationship when it comes to the potato. But it took until the middle of the 18th century until this man, Frederick the Great, the very important Prussian king, became a staunch supporter of the potato because he had a private chef, and that chef was from France, and he really loved potatoes. And so he also showed Frederick how incredible versatile potatoes are. But the thing is that, of course, at the time, everything was what? Buckwheat. Remember the buckwheat that was coming from Russia. And yeah, buckwheat, right? And so what happened to Frederick was that he wanted all the people who were living in his kingdom, like mostly the farmers, he wanted them to embrace the potato agriculturally. But the farmers were very hesitant because some of them had eaten the potato raw and they were spitting it out, and they were saying, "This is disgusting. I'm not going to, stop doing buckwheat. This is ridiculous." And so this is why, and look at this painting, how wonderful this is. Our Frederick the Great, our king, would actually go to the rural areas, and he would talk to the farmers, and he would explain to them, "Listen, this is how we do it. You have to, do whatever with the potato because it's so versatile." And so that is why the potato really became the German vegetable. And to this day, it is pretty amazing. We are growing 700 different varieties of potatoes, and every German is eating 160 pounds of potatoes per year. And this is more than you, because Americans are eating 122 pounds of potatoes every year. Isn't that so interesting? So I, of course, lived in Berlin for many years. And so I often went to his castle, to Frederick the Great's castle, Sanssouci. One day I was walking, kind of moseying along, and all of a sudden I'm looking down, and this is what I see. Potatoes. He put potatoes on his marble floor. So there you can see how much he loved potatoes. And by the way, the Germans are also very thankful to this day to Frederick the Great for introducing them to the potatoes, because look, at his grave, some faithful souls are visiting his grave in the city of Potsdam, and they are leaving potatoes as a symbolic gesture. So now let's move to the 19th century, because this is an exciting time. This is the time of the industrialization, and that too, of course, changed German food culture profoundly because of this man. This is Karl von Linde, and he was the inventor in 1874. He was the inventor of the refrigerator, and that, of course, was such a game changer, because now it was allowing distribution of food over large distances and time spans. Food wasn't only seasonal anymore, and so that was really quite amazing. Then we have something in the 1890s, and that is a canning factory. Interesting. What is this canning factory canning? Sausages. And where is it? In Frankfurt. That is why we call them the Frankfurters, because of that first canning factory that was invented in Frankfurt. Also, with the advent of the Social Democratic Party that tried to improve conditions for the poor, we have now food slowly undergoing a process of democratization. And that means that formerly luxurious items like sugar or coffee were now becoming much more affordable. And look, women were able to go to the coffee house. And then, of course, look at the dog. Somebody even brought a dog. And so the more food was available, the more kind of spoiled people are getting, because this is also the beginning of the 20th century. This is when people are looking at other avenues in terms of people are interested in vegetarianism, or they actually are now abstaining from tobacco, from coffee, from alcohol. They are mostly interested in, like health food. Like, for example, this man that you see here, Sebastian Kneipp, he was a monk and he was like your Kellogg's cornflakes people, the Kellogg's brothers. So it's all about that. It's a little bit, it's a little extravagant, but of course you can imagine 1914 when the First World War starts, this extravagance is totally going out of the window, because especially then 4 years later when the war is over, now hunger is of course reigning in Germany. And not only that, but then in the early 1920s, we have that hyperinflation. And look what these little kids are doing. This is actually money. They are playing with money because the hyperinflation was so incredible that, for example, a loaf of bread could have been like 11 trillion marks. I mean, really like out of this world numbers. When then the Nazis come to power, they are encouraging people to eat what they perceived as Germanic foods. That would be a pork roast, that would be sauerbraten, sauerkraut, red cabbage, dumplings, these kinds of things. And then when the Second World War started in 1939, food rationing quickly followed. The Germans were strongly advised by the Nazi leadership to have stew Sundays. They were calling them the Eintopfsonntage, and that meant that it was a general appeal to the housewives that they would, every time when they would during the week when they would cook and they would have some leftovers, they would take them and then they would on Sundays make a big stew. And then they would also, if they had enough food, they would then they would talk to their neighbors and then maybe invite the neighbors. It was all about communal war efforts. As you can imagine, with the end of World War II and almost with the entire destruction of the country, hunger ruled. Also, the black market was quite rampant. There was an American food writer by the name of Nika Standen Hazelton. She wrote a book in the 1960s, The Cooking of Germany. And she was there in 1945 and she traveled, through the country. And look what she says, very fascinating. In those days, potatoes were a luxury. Coffee was made of acorns and tea from apple peelings. 6-foot men weighed less than 100 pounds, and children combed the fields for rotting cabbages and turnips. In some ways, the period of near starvation after World War II was worse than the war itself, and it probably provided the unconscious motive behind the food crazes that have swept Germany since the war. And one has to say, because of because of the Marshall Plan, because of the help of the Americans, the political and the economic situation of Germany improved quite a bit. So the food rationing was in West Germany only until 1950. In East Germany, the food rationing lasted until 1958. But then when we move into the 1950s, especially the West Germans, they embarked, I'm telling you, on a wave of gluttony, or as we would call it, the Fresswelle. They were just eating, 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 eating. So let me just give you some interesting numbers. Between 1950 and 1960, the consumption of pork in West Germany rose from 42 pounds to 66 pounds per person. The consumption of poultry tripled, but the consumption of potatoes fell from 400 pounds to 250 pounds, which still is a lot, but still you can imagine the Germans have had it with the potato and they are eating, eating, eating. So of course, what happens if you're eating, eating, eating? You're getting a Wohlstandsbauch, which is another German word, and that means, of course, the affluence belly. And here we have a very important man who was the holder of an affluence belly. That is the chancellor at that time, Ludwig Erhard. This is now, I'm going to now show you my most favorite picture. Oh. Look, a Konditorei. A Konditorei is not a bakery, it's a patisserie. And Here we see those housewives. Isn't that so wonderful? They're getting ready for a coffee clutch. And there you can see when you look at that, Germany's back, right? So in the 1960s, we are not going to have any kind of food rationing. But you know what's so funny also is in the 50s, there's a new era in media. So we have TV is coming into Germany, and 1952, this is when this happens. And then a year later, in 1953, we have the first cooking show that is coming on the air. And this is our German Julia child. This is a man by the name of Clemens Wilmenrod. And Clemens Wilmenrod had this it was such a big show. Everybody loved him. The show was on until 1964, like 11 or 12 years, and it was watched by millions of people who eagerly tried to recreate the creations that he did. And one of them is Toast Hawaii. And this is so funny because my mother, she was like a little girl at the time. And she would forever always say that in Hawaii, people are eating this. She totally misunderstood. Because what this is actually a creation that Clemens Wilmenrod created. And so what this is, of course, it's a buttered slice of toast that is topped with boiled ham and a slice of canned pineapple. Hence the name Toast Hawaii. It's a nod to, of course, Hawaii. And then you are putting a piece of cheese on top of this. You are putting it underneath the broiler for a minute. And then when this is finished, you are decorating it with a bright cocktail cherry. And this is what people thought was like the height of luxury, at the time. When we think about the 1960s, this, of course, is also the time when in Germany we have the guest workers. So these are people, who are coming from all kinds of Southern European areas, Turkey and Spain and Italy. And they, of course, are also bringing their iconic dishes. The first pizzeria in Germany opens in 1952. And guess what also comes to Germany? You! McDonald's, 1971 is the year when the first McDonald's opens in Munich. And so that's the first McDonald's in all of Germany. And it's still thriving today. As you can see, people still love McDonald's quite a bit. So then we, of course, have 1989. And this is when the Berlin Wall falls. And then, of course, in the 1990s, we have the unification. But what is so wonderful about this is also, this is now when the East Germans are able to embark on their own, wave of gluttony, because now they are eating all kinds of things that they never had the chance to eat for the last 45 years. But that then became boring maybe a decade later. And so that is why relatively recently, in the last, I would say, decade, we have ostalgia. Ostalgia is it's like a word construct between Ost and nostalgia, which means the East and nostalgia. So you are, in a way, nostalgic. You have like a pang in your heart for the East. And so that is why in East Germany, we have like little stores where people can buy products that were created, in East Germany, the products that they grew up with. And not only that, we also have the Little Red Riding Hood sparkling wine, which is actually quite a successful story, because that has become the market leader in the sparkling wine segment. And that is an East German brand. When it comes to nowadays, what are we Germans eating? Well, I mean, we have the same problems as everybody else. People are getting overweight. We only have 8% of Germans who are vegetarians. Everybody else loves a sausage. And of course, when you come to a German supermarket, this is what you will see. Of course, our doctors are also telling us you have to eat more whole foods, you have to have more vegetables and so on. But we do love our bread. Oh, it's the greatest thing ever. We have 38,000 bakeries, and those 38,000 bakeries are making $17 billion every year. So it really is our love, And, when it comes to bread, bread is so pliable, bread is so versatile. So for example, here, this is in 2006 when we were in Germany, we were hosting the soccer world championship, and so everybody was buying bread that was looking like a soccer ball. And then in 2014 we won the soccer world championship, so that's why we were, of course, buying this again. And this is Brötchen. Brötchen is, of course, the diminutive form of bread, and Brötchen is these. Oh, they're so delicious. So yeah, what can I tell you? How wonderful is German food? But now, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to go on a very, very fast plane because now we are traveling. We're traveling to Germany, and we are starting in the north. If you take a look at the north, what do you see? It's very close to Denmark. It's very close to Scandinavia. There is lots of water. So, of course, I'm not telling you anything new when I tell you that people in the north have great seafood. So they are eating that a lot. But one of the iconic dishes in this area is Fliederbeersuppe mit Klüten, which means elderberry soup with semolina dumplings. And of course, when it comes to the elderberries, you see the proximity to Scandinavia, because this is also very big in Sweden. And so people are eating it in two different variations. So if you want to have it as a first course, you would have it as a soup, and you would have it warm, and then you would not have the semolina dumplings. The dumplings you really only have if you are eating it as a dessert. And, I personally, I was born in Hessen. I was born in Frankfurt. I, unfortunately, have never in my life eaten elderberry soup with gluten, which is so sad. But I have a friend who grew up in Hamburg, in this region there, in northern Germany. And so I was calling her when I was doing research for this topic. I called her and I said, "Have you ever heard of it?" And she said, "Heard of it? We're having it every day." So there you can see, these differences, because if you would go to a supermarket in Hamburg, you are not going to be able to find this elderberry soup. But I would sure like to try it, right? Look at the nice semolina dumplings, and that they are, they have like vanilla in them, and it sounds really delicious. This area in northern Germany also has countless apples. It's a very fertile ground. And not only that, remember our sauerkraut obsession, we have to have cabbage, and cabbage is also grown there. I have heard of the wine queen. I have heard of the beer queen. There's even a malt wine queen, but I've never heard of the cabbage queens. What a fun thing to be. Hello, I'm a cabbage queen. And here we see, all those other representatives who are, kind of just like brand ambassadors. But yeah, so in northern Germany, we have the cabbage queens. So now, if we go to the Harz region, this is Lower Saxony, Niedersachsen. This is where the Harz Mountains are. And this is also where the Harzer Käse, the Harzer cheeses, are available. This is strongly flavored sour milk cheese. This has a pungent odor. When I grew up, my father ate that, and I would always like run away screaming, because this was not my cup of tea at all. But what they also have in this region is the moorland sheep. I bet you will not find a moorland sheep in the Munich region. This is really something that is happening in northern Germany. And so these are the Heideschnucke. These are usually eaten on special days, and they yield a venison-like meat. But so the everyday food when it comes to these people in northern Germany is the Steckrübeneintopf, which is also known, of course, as a Rutabaga stew. And Steckrüben is rutabagas, and they have potatoes, pork, and then, of course, the rutabagas. The Hanseatic port cities of Hamburg, Bremen, and Lübeck, also Rostock, if you want to, of course, connect them with the former East Germany, they have their culinary heritage because they are, of course, the ones, that have really for like many, many centuries done lots of trade, And what is so amazing about that is Lübeck. And Lübeck is famous for marzipan. So it's not that marzipan was invented there. No, 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 because marzipan is actually the art of making marzipan is more than 1,000 years old. It has its origins in the Near East, and then it spread to Lübeck. And you know what is marzipan? Marzipan consists primarily of sugar and almond meal. Sometimes they put a little rose water in there too. And so what happened was that in the year 1806, a young man by the name of Johann Georg Niederegger founded a confectioner's shop on the market square on this area, on this location here. Of course, now this is like the newest iteration of it. And so this is when he started a factory production of marzipan. And this store is still very, very popular today. And you can get all kinds of marzipan creations. Look at all these nice apples. You could actually have one, you could buy one and say, tell your friends, look, I am eating so healthily. I have a Granny Smith apple. And then in reality, it's only made out of sugar and almonds. Or you have vegetables, or you have weather frogs. And then here we have the Marzipan Museum in Lübeck, which of course is telling people about the history of the city. And of course, all the important figures of this region are all made out of almonds and sugar. So now let's hop over to the east, because that is where I was born in Frankfurt, but I lived for many years in Berlin. And Berlin, this is the area where we have a lot of Slavic, Silesian, but also French influences. This all comes from the fact that, for example, the Huguenots from France, they were coming to Berlin. And then, of course, people from the eastern areas. And so then what we have there, it's Prussia, right? And so that's why, of course, everybody is all about the potato and also about pork. And this is a boulette. A boulette looks a little bit like what you have on your hamburger. That is a flattened pan-fried meat patty. And then something that is also considered a quintessential Berliner dish is something that I don't even know if you would pay me $1 million if I would actually eat that. I mean, I would do it for the money, but of course, can you imagine? This is a boiled, cured pork knuckle. I have, that I had an uncle, and this was his favorite meal. But the operative word in that sentence is, I had an uncle. So this man has not survived because, too many pork knuckles there. And then, of course, people are eating that with lots of sauerkraut. But, of course, the quintessential German soup would be a potato soup, Kartoffelsuppe. But, of course, since we are Germans, we have a sausage with them, mostly a Knackwurst. The most famous sausage, or one of the most famous sausages, is the Thüringer Rostbratwurst. Thüringen, or Thuringia, is a little south of Berlin, and these are spicy grilled sausages from coarsely ground meat, and they are flavored with fresh caraway, with nutmeg, and then they are, interestingly enough, actually, they are packed into a hog's or a sheep's casing, and then they are basted with beer, and that makes them quite delicious. And it's really kind of interesting how they are looking, because they are so much bigger than the bread. And but this is how you are eating it, as Angela Merkel is telling us. This is how you eat them. When you go a little bit down, from Thuringia, you come to Saxony, and this is where Dresden is. And Dresden is the home of the famous Christ log, which is a yeast cake that is filled with candied fruits and nuts and so on. And this already was invented in the 14th century. And you know what's so interesting? The oblong form and the very generous use of the powdered sugar is actually supposed to be reminiscent of little baby Jesus in a white blanket. That is the reason behind that. And here we have a Stollenmädchen. So that also is one of these ambassadors. But why isn't she a queen? Or why isn't she a princess? Why is she only a girl? Well, we will never find out. So now we are moving to the area that you like, I am sure, because this is Westphalia, or North Rhine-Westphalia, because this is where pork and potatoes are very important elements in the region. The Westphalian pigs are traditionally fattened in oak woods, and that makes for exceptional Westphalian ham. Westphalian ham has been a delicacy for many centuries. This is a postcard from 1916, and look what they have there. They're sending this into the world with, like, look what we have Westphalian ham, and then of course also the pumpernickel bread. And then this is a church, it's a window of a church in Soest, which is also in Westphalia. And so this is from around the year 1500. And so if you take a look at what's happening there, it depicts, of course, the Last Supper with Jesus and the disciples. But if you look closely, what is Jesus, a Jewish person at the time? What is Jesus? What are they eating? They're eating Westphalian ham. How amazing. The Rhineland, of course, also belongs to this region, and this is it. I bet many of you have waited for this picture, the Sauerbraten, which means, of course, sour roast. It is a pork roast that is marinated with vinegar, with wine, with spices before braising. The most important thing that you have to remember is that if you have a Sauerbraten, you cannot, under no circumstances, have sauerkraut. You have to have the red cabbage, the Rotkraut, because that red cabbage is much, like sweeter, and that is going to balance out the Sauerbraten really beautifully. Some people have potatoes, but potatoes, I mean, really, potatoes are kind of boring. Can't we have these nice klöße, as we say, or potato dumplings? I think they are so much more delicious when it comes to that. Or what you should also have with it, wine, beer, the Kölsch or the Altbier. If you are eating Sauerbraten in Cologne, you have the light beer, which would be the one to the left. If you are eating Sauerbraten in Düsseldorf, you have the Alt beer, the dark one, the ale. If you are visiting Cologne and you're saying, can I have an alt beer? You're going to be thrown out of the restaurant. So you have to be very careful. People do not know any fun when it comes to these two beers. They are very restricted. The light is in Cologne, the dark is in Düsseldorf. So now we come to my home state of Hessen, and this is so famous for the Frankfurter Kranz. The Frankfurter Kranz dates back to the 18th century. It's a firm sponge cake that is filled with buttercream. And then, of course, it is also it's filled with buttercream on the outside. There's another layer of buttercream, and that is then topped with caramel-covered brittle nuts. And that is called croquant. And so in the year 1735, it was the first time we are seeing it, written down, that in 1735, this Frankfurter Kranz was created in the city of Frankfurt. And you might think, what is it? Why? Why is that? Well, it's because of this. It's because of the fact that until 1806, Frankfurt was the coronation site for the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nations. And so that is why a baker had this idea to create a crown. And so here we see it does resemble a crown, doesn't it? Because we have the croquant that looks like the gold. We have the red cherries that are supposed to represent the rubies. And then, last but not least, we have our last destination, and that is the South. And the South, of course, is beer country and wine country. But when it comes to beer, the Oktoberfest, we just were winding it down. The Oktoberfest usually has about 7 million people who are going there. But why do we have an Oktoberfest? Well, it's because of these two people. We have Crown Prince Ludwig and his wife Therese, or his bride Therese. They were married at the end of September in 1810. And so because they were so happy about their nuptials, that they were having this huge celebration. It was like 10 days long, and everybody who lived in Munich was invited. So then it was such a success that the next year they were looking at each other saying, you know what, didn't we have a great time last year at our wedding? Let's do this again. And so for their first wedding anniversary, they were doing this again. They were inviting everybody again. And then the next year, they were saying, we should do this again. And so that is how gradually, the Oktoberfest was kind of coming into existence, because we are celebrating the wedding of those two people. And you might think, who even are those two people? Well, you might not know them, but I'm sure that you know their grandson, because their grandson is Mad King Ludwig. And that is that young, gorgeous king there in Bavaria, who is so famous for having created these breathtakingly beautiful architectural creations like Neuschwanstein Castle in the Bavarian Alps. I mean, when we think about the Oktoberfest, of course, yes, people are drinking a lot of beer, but they also are having a Weißwurst. And the Weißwurst is a sausage that you will not find in Hamburg, in the butcher shops there. And so this is really something that is very specific to Munich, to Bavaria. It is a finely minced veal and fresh pork bacon, that's a sausage, and then it's flavored with parsley, lemon, mace, ginger, cardamom. Isn't that so fascinating? Because this is really because they already had that many centuries ago. They already had all of these ingredients because of the Crusaders, all of the spices and so on. And so in the city of Munich alone, 100,000 of them are being eaten every day. And mostly they're being eaten here in the beer gardens. Not only that, you of course also have, if you have a sausage, you have to have a pretzel. This is very important. In southern Germany, in these regions, for example, in Stuttgart, we say Bretze. In Munich, we say Bretzen. And then, it's kind of regional. The regional dialects are kind of saying that differently, as you can see there. But what is it? I mean, of course, we know it's a nice, delicious pretzel. But why is it? Why does it have this weird form? Well, a great story behind it too. These pretzels were invented by a monk in the Middle Ages as a pedagogical tool, because he wanted to teach young children how to hold their hands in prayer. And if they were successful, he would give them one of these pretzels that depicted the perfect hand position. And you might say to me, what are you even talking about? Well, let me show you. Oh, isn't that amazing? Because when you look at it, you see, and you look at it, from the top, you see that that is exactly how you have to hold your hands. Hmm. And of course, let's see, let's just in enjoy some fun impressions of the Oktoberfest. So the Swabian region, of course, also in southern Germany, I bet many of you love a Spätzle. And these are, of course, the very famous Mehlspeisen. Remember, we were talking about this earlier, that these are those flour-based dishes. And not only are those very famous in the south, but we also have Maultaschen. And the Maultaschen have a hilarious origin story, I can tell you. The Maultaschen are said to have been invented by bored southern German cooks during Lent, because people in southern Germany were not able to eat meat. So that is why the cooks were taking meat, they were grinding it really small, tiny, and then they were mixing it with some other ingredients, and they were hiding it under a pasta-like shell so that God doesn't see it. Isn't that so cute? And so to this day, people in the South are eating Maultaschen during Lent, although they shouldn't, but they are doing it. And they are calling the Maultaschen Herrgottsbescheißerle, which means little god cheaters. Of course, the South has the Black Forest, beautiful Black Forest. What is famous about that? The Kirschtorte, the Black Forest cherry cake. The Black Forest cherry cake was dedicated by a this is actually in the 20th century. We had somebody who was living in, he was originally from Bonn, and then he was living in the Black Forest for a little bit, and then he came back to Bonn, and there he was like a baker, and there he was creating that Black Forest cherry cake because he wanted to pay homage to those girls, because these are the girls from the Black Forest and they have their traditional costumes there. And this is exactly what that is, because we have, of course, the white blouse that would be representative of the whipped cream. Then we have the hat that they have that would, of course, be the cherries and so on. And then the black dress is the chocolate cake. So now, this is at last, we have Nuremberg. And Nuremberg is famous for two things. One is the Nuremberg sausage. The Nuremberg sausage, the first time that we are reading about the Nuremberg sausage is in the year 1313. And what is happening with them is that they are only 3 inches long. And you might think, why in 1313 did some butcher think that that was a good idea? Well, the thing about it is, first of all, we have people are not eating 1. People are eating sometimes 6 or 4. If you are like a big, strong man who is working in construction, you sometimes have 12. I mean, it really is quite a bit. But there's an amusing story behind that, and behind that really small size. And that has to do with the fact that there was a prison in the Middle Ages in Nuremberg. And because of that small size, the relatives of the prisoners were also able to feed those little sausages through the keyholes in the cells. So they were able to visit their relatives and then just like put like these little sausages, push the sausages through the keyholes. And then, of course, the other famous thing that, of course, Nuremberg is famous for is the Lebkuchen, the gingerbread, especially now since we are moving into, the festive season. This is where it's at. You have to have Lebkuchen, you have to have gingerbread. And now we are making like a 100, what is that, like a 360? Right? Because we are now back at the beginning of the presentation, because this is exactly what this is. In the 13th century, we have monks in Franconia who are taking all of these spices that they get from the Crusaders, and they are aniseed, coriander, cloves, ginger, cardamom, allspice, cinnamon, all kinds of spices, all kinds of nuts, and they are then creating these little cakes. and they are supposed to protect you from evil spirits. And here we have, you can get them at the Oktoberfest. You can, of course, also get them at the Christmas market. Here, this is from Oktoberfest. These are not really delicious. These are more ones that you are, hanging around your neck and so on. But definitely, if you have Aldi, an Aldi store or a world market, you have to go after Thanksgiving. This is when you have the Lebkuchen. So at the end of our exploration, when it comes to German food, I would like to to burst your bubble. Is this German? No. The German chocolate cake is not German. And I am going to now tell you why, because it's really quite fascinating. So what happened was that in 1852, there was an Englishman by the name of Samuel German. He was born in England. He then came to America. I think he was in the, I want to say St. Louis area. I don't know exactly. But he created baking chocolate. So he invented baking chocolate. And then that baking chocolate was called German's baking chocolate. Fast forward to 1957, a housewife in Dallas, Texas, is entering a baking competition. She uses German chocolate from Mr. German, and she's making a coconut pecan frosting on a chocolate cake. And then she wins it. And the newspapers is writing German's chocolate cake. And then somehow the apostrophe got lost, and somehow people were thinking it's German cake. But I'm telling you, where would we in Germany have coconut? So this is really quite the story. So the next time you're going to a party or whatever, you could tell that wonderful story that the German chocolate cake is actually not German and that it was invented in 1957 by a housewife from Dallas, Texas. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with me this evening on this educational and I hope enjoyable culinary exploration of my home country. And I hope that you are now not starving, but maybe tomorrow you're going to a nice store or a restaurant, a German restaurant, and you're buying some nice German food. So thank you, everybody. I am going to now stop the share so that I can see you. And then, of course, you can ask your questions or tell me what is your most beloved German food.
So while people are typing questions, I did put the link to the survey in the chat, if you can take a moment to fill that out. Our first question is, do they eat hamburgers in Hamburg?
Well, yeah, they would eat hamburgers because of the fact that, of course, we do have McDonald's and Burger King. I think we have that also there. But the hamburger is not really from Hamburg. I think it is because I don't know really the kind of origin story, but I don't think it has anything to do with Hamburg.
We've got lots of thank yous and very interesting.
Thank you.
Give it a minute here to see if anybody else is typing.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to, this to the Lebkuchen again. That's always my favorite thing about Christmas is the gingerbread.
Do they make the gingerbread houses like we do, or is
Yes, we do have gingerbread houses, and then of course people are meeting on Sunday afternoons, and then they are making their own, especially kids, get to decorate the gingerbread houses. Yeah.
Someone asks if there are any good German restaurants in Kansas City, and I'll be honest, I don't know.
No, since
So if somebody knows, feel free to share in the chat.
Yeah.
Um,
And you're reaching me here in Miami, so I can't really speak to Kansas City.
Someone else asked, are there now foreign cuisines that are popular in Germany?
Oh,
Example,
yes.
Japanese or Indian.
Yes, yes. I mean, if we would now have a top 10 of German food in terms of what do, like the Germans of 2025, what do they eat, then of course it would be, like spaghetti, bolognese, pizza. That would definitely get a part, would have a part in the top 10. And of course, because of the fact that we have a very big Turkish influence. In Germany, we have about 3 million Turkish people who are living there. So that is also why lots of Germans like gyros and, the other thing. I don't really know a lot about Turkish food because I am a vegetarian, and then B, life in middle age is very terrible because now I can have gluten for 3 months. And that actually means that I have to make my own buckwheat bread, which is a far cry from the nice German bread that one can have. Ah,
Let's see. Somebody says that they've heard that the Grunauer here in Kansas City is good. So
okay.
there you go. Someone else says that they were in Berlin this summer and the sauerkraut is good compared to here in the US.
Mm-hmm.
Um, was Russian cooking big in East Germany?
Yes, definitely. The thing about East Germany was absolutely fascinating because, the fact that we have, of course, about 16 million Germans who were living in East Germany. And so Germany was divided for 45 years. And so these people in East Germany were not able to travel to the West, right? So they were able to travel to all kinds of East Bloc countries. So if somebody from, let's say, Dresden wanted to spend a weekend in Prague, they were able to do it. Or if they wanted to spend their whole summer in St. Petersburg, they were able to do it. But they were never able to go to like all the other countries in the world. And so that is why the East Germans developed a very an international taste in terms of that they were fascinated by cookbooks. And and I think it's I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but I think it really has to do with the fact that since they were not able to go and visit those places, that is why cookbooks and international cookbooks were extremely popular in East Germany. And there was in the 1960s the only Japanese sushi restaurant that was opening in East Germany, and of course, the wait lists were 2 years. People were waiting for 2 years for a table there. And of course, they didn't have any. I mean, did they have sushi rice? No, they didn't have sushi rice. So they were taking arborio rice, which is the rice that you are using for milk rice, like creamed rice. Then the other question is, did they have salmon? No, they didn't have salmon. They were using local fish, and they were actually dyeing it with like beet color so that it would look like salmon. It's really quite fascinating. I have a whole lecture on how people in East Germany lived, and it's really quite fascinating.
We've got a couple questions here about cookbooks. Someone says, what is the best authentic German cookbook?
Well, what you need to do, let me see if I have that here. What you need to do is you have to find a German partner and get married in Germany. Because when I got married in Berlin, the Justice of the Peace gave me and my husband a cookbook. And that is something that everybody gets when they get married. It's like a little gift, from the government, and it's a beautiful cookbook. But of course, it would be in German. So I don't really know of an English book, of an English cookbook. But I would, at this point in 2025, I would just kind of Google and kind of see, even, ChatGPT, even AI would maybe be able to give you some really good recipes.
Well, and that was the next question. Someone asked if you had any recommended websites for German recipes. So,
No. Yeah, because I am, when it comes to the German food, I'm such a bad German, because I don't eat the sauerbraten and everything, because I don't eat meat, and I love. I do eat a sauerkraut, but I love the red cabbage. I love a red cabbage. Ooh, yes, that is nice. But yeah. And I'm mostly, when it comes to this, I'm mostly the historian who loves like origin stories about food, not so much the cook in that sense.
uh, and then our last question here, someone asks if Black Forest ham is from Germany.
Yeah, of course. Black Forest ham. It is in competition with the Westphalian ham, because the Westphalian ham is, of course, from the area about like Cologne, Düsseldorf. And then, of course, the Schwarzwälder ham is also quite delectable. This is the smoked ham. And what is also important is the wild mushroom dishes. So especially when it comes to the Black Forest, lots of people there are still foraging for mushrooms. And yeah, for example, I have a friend, one of my close friends, is living in this area, and she learned that from her mom. So they would then, go and would look for mushrooms, and then they would make like mushroom dishes. Yeah, it's nice.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming, and thank you, Annette, for joining us again. We hope everybody will join us for future programs, and have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm hoping that in 2026, we're going to see each other again. Bye bye, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.